when I had this idea of going to Rwanda, doing neuroscience research and so on, many people told me, but that's impossible. No one can do neuroscience in this context, in rural regions like that. I understand the concern, but at the same time, you do research there as you would do in a lab. It's just that it requires more steps. Like, of course, you have to find these populations, you have to gain their trust, you have to work with NGOs, you have to transport your material to the field. Of course, it's far less easy than with university students in your lab. But I mean, the human experience of doing such research in this context are worth everything.
Hello and welcome to SciLux, the podcast where we talk about scientific developments and technological changes. And remember, the podcast that is for people who love science and these ones that still need a bit of convincing. So the ones that hopefully will love the science after our discussion today. And the discussion is with Emilie Caspar, who is a professor at Ghent University, Belgium, specializing in social and cognitive neuroscience. And we'll be talking a lot about obedience. Thank you, Emilie, for coming today.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
So you have done field research in Rwanda and in Cambodia. And my question to you is, why bother?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And actually, some colleagues ask me the same. So, as you said, my main topic of research is obedience. And I'm trying to understand why so many human beings use the justification of just following orders to commit atrocities, notably during genocides. And in neuroscience, most of the research conducted is conducted in labs. So it means that we develop experimental paradigms, we test students or population around, and we try to understand, for instance, the mechanism of obedience. And I was doing that with neuroscience methods, trying to understand how obedience impacts the brain. But most obedience research, notably the famous ones conducted by Stanley Milgram, were used to explain mass atrocities and genocides. But at no point, someone did conduct similar studies among a population who truly participated actively in a genocide. And so I decided that I wanted to create or to develop a more ecologically valid research. And so I decided to bring neuroscience to the field in countries where genocide truly occurred, notably in Cambodia, but also in Rwanda, to test people who actually obeyed or disobeyed orders during a genocide to really understand better the mechanism of obedience and resistance to orders in such contexts.
You used a term that I also noticed in your articles that is confusing for a layperson, ecologically valid. Why ecologically? What does it mean in the literature, actually?
Yeah, it's not related to ecology overall. What it means is that what is difficult in psychology or neuroscience research is to try to draw conclusion on how the human brain functions or human behaviors when you just do studies in a lab, because you never know if the behaviors that you observe in a lab will truly be those that you can see outside of the lab. And so in this context, ecological validity means trying to bring something more natural by testing people who have, like, for instance, a real knowledge of these events, or trying to have paradigms that are more naturalistic and not just fictional, or using questionnaires in hypothetical scenarios, for instance.
With students of psychology, right?
Most of the time, yes.
That's also the interesting part that you write about it. And of course, we hopefully listeners of the podcast know the term weird, right? So we tend to talk about the populations from the Western countries, students of psychology or whatever, students of something that you research, rather than, as you said, ecologically valid. I'm going to continue using this right now. Populations in the field that actually experience certain things without just, extrapolating on the audiences that we are researching in a lab.
Yeah, exactly.
I asked about the why bother because I have to say that I had my rabbit hole moment yesterday. I started reading your blog. We will share the link in the show notes for the blog. And what I loved, it was the first time I was reading so much about behind the scenes of work. Of course, it could also happen for the lab work. There is a lot that doesn't work. And this is super interesting for me. I wish more scientists were writing about that part. But in your case, I mean, it was just so difficult for both countries. Let's start with Rwanda. How was it to do research there? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, honestly, it's funny. I always respond in two ways. On the one hand, of course, it's difficult, especially because no one really did neuroscience research in the field in Rwanda before, especially on those populations. I mean, Yeah, technically I'm the first one bringing EEG to the field, electroencephalography, for instance, and testing actual former genocide perpetrators or rescuers with these technologies in their own villages. And in that sense, it's difficult because I had to develop this to find ways to do it because no one did that before. But on the other hand, it's less complicated than one might think. When I had this idea of going to Rwanda, doing neuroscience research and so on, many people told me, but that's impossible. No one can do neuroscience in this context, in rural regions like that. And I understand the concern, but at the same point, you do research there as you would do in a lab. It's just that it requires more steps. Like, of course, you have to find these populations, you have to gain their trust, you have to work with NGOs, you have to transport your material to the field. So, of course, it's far less easy than with university students in your lab. But I mean, the human experience of doing such research in this context are worth everything.
Of course, definitely. Before we continue discussing Rwanda, I think it's a good moment to explain a little bit for those people who don't know how you do neuroscience research. So what you said that you were transporting, let's say, a more portable version of an EEG, but there's also MRI and fMRI. So what I would like to know is, what are these?
So it's actually two different techniques that allow us to understand how the brain works. They offer different advantages and disadvantages. For instance, fMRI is very good to have very clear, I would say, brain pictures, or to really know exactly what brain region was activated during this or that task. So that's the big advantage. EEG cannot have such a good spatial resolution to really inform about specific brain regions. But the disadvantages of fMRI is that it's very slow. So you can track the activity of a brain region, but it will take several seconds. So you can not really track a behavior like with a good temporal resolution, while EEG allows that because it records the activity of neurons and it has a precision of milliseconds. And also, and especially for field research, fMRI is hard to find in many countries, very expensive, and it's not mobile at all. So it means that you have to bring participants most of the time to a hospital so they can go inside an MRI scanner and you scan their brain. While with electroencephalography, it's just a small box actually. So you can transport it anywhere and test people where they are. And in the case of Rwanda, for instance, we rather use electroencephalography because given the population we tested, especially former genocide perpetrators, many of them told us that they would not dare to go to Kigali, so the main city of Rwanda, because they were afraid of people taking revenge or I don't know. And for them, they conducted a genocide, but they have never left their rural regions. They have grown up in small villages. They were incarcerated nearby after a genocide and they were released and they're just afraid of big cities. So it was not even an option to have them coming to Kigali to be put in this huge fMRI machine. I mean, even Westerners can be very afraid of fMRI machines. It causes claustrophobia and so on. Here, I'm testing people who have never seen anything like this before. And so with electroencephalography, we could actually put them in our car and travel into their own villages to test them. That was far easier.
You keep saying fMRI. Is there a difference between fMRI and MRI?
Yes. So MRI is more for the structure of the brain. For instance, if you have, you had an accident and, medical doctors, they want to see if your brain is intact. They would rather do an MRI to really see the structure of your brain. fMRI, the F is for functional. So it's something that we use more in neuroscience, especially when people have to make behaviors or decisions, because we can track how the activity is engaged during those tasks.
And EEG, for people who don't know, that's this kind of interesting looking cap where you attach electrodes.
Yes.
Is that electrodes? Yes, exactly. Okay.
Exactly.
And you have to, I noticed also that there is a lot of challenges, though you can travel with it, right? There are a lot of challenges, for example, the hair structure, right? Not all hair is good for EEG.
Yeah, but honestly, less than expected. So most of the time, EEG, indeed, it's not invasive. You just put some gel on the scalp and you put some electrodes and you record the electric activity of the brain. But that's a huge fight for me, so that's why I will make a small point of that. Many people in neuroscience think that, for instance, when you have Afro hairstyles, it's too complicated to get a good signal. And so they systematically exclude a huge part of the population just because of their hairs. And I'm doing research in Africa. I've tested people with so many different hairstyles that I can ensure that in 95% of the case, you can do EEG on Afro hairstyles. So it's not a point to discriminate and exclude people from these studies. But of course, there is a 5% that makes the type of hair impossible. It's not really the type of hair. It's more like if you have a wig, for instance, of course, it's impossible because, you are not in contact with the scalp. Mm-hmm. But other than that, for me, inclusivity in neuroscience is very important. And clearly, it's possible to do it, but it requires just a bit more practice.
Very important point. I think that our discussion today will be a little bit about this, right? Is like try first and maybe then say it's not possible, right? Exactly. I remember I was organizing here in Luxembourg Young Women's Conference to convince more girls to go to the STEM fields. And we had a very, very interesting keynote speech by René Schröder, who is a biologist, studied RNA. She's now based in Austria. And she was saying exactly that one of the things that she hated the most is that you can't do it. It won't work, right? And I'll show you it can, right? We should never, especially in science, we should never start with that because then we'll be just going around in circles in the same field, right?
Exactly.
Instead of going out.
And you see people repeating exactly the same. Oh, I will exclude Afro hairstyles because it's not possible. They haven't even tried. So,
exactly. Yeah. Yes. So this is an important message. Remember, please don't assume that it doesn't work because you read it somewhere. Maybe check first, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So going back to Rwanda. So you arrived there with your EEG, more or less without any problems. I know there was some kind of a thinking of how to do it and diplomatic routes, let's say. But also what was interesting for me as well is that there is an ethical committee in Rwanda. Mm-hmm. And you were writing that you were one of the first to actually think to ask them about the research.
Yes, in this context, yes. In psychology or neuroscience, especially since the studies of Stanley Milgram on obedience, when we conduct studies, we have to ask for an ethics approval to make sure that, everything is going safely, that participants are protected and so on. And something I've seen a lot in the field, especially for people doing field research, not in neuroscience, I don't have that many examples, but at least with, questionnaires or interviews, is that people ask their ethics committee in their own country to then do research in another country. And that's not okay because cultural norms can be different, legal norms can be different. And when I was reading a lot about the literature in psychology conducted in Rwanda, none of them asked the ethics committee in Rwanda, while there is one that exists for a long time. And for me, that's very important. Of course, in some countries there were some complications and I could not ask a proper ethics committee there. So if it doesn't exist or if you have institutional issues with those ethics committees, such as it's the case for Israel at the moment, well, no, we just need to ask one, and most of the time it's the one from our university. But in Rwanda, there is one. They know their population. They know what is good or not or acceptable or not. So it's very important to ask for their approval as well.
And to keep trying, right? Because it's not always easy with approvals, with field work when it comes to actually first being able to go there and then also find the population you want to research, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but honestly, this step was not that complicated because they have standards that are closely related to what I'm used to. So that's fine. But of course, it just requires time.
Yes, exactly. Sometimes longer than always longer. And the same goes with time when you do the research itself, right? I remember you were writing that you should basically always book a couple of hours more because everything can happen. And that's not only in Rwanda, but also because you also did research in prisons and you did the research with military. So, there's always something that it's an added, maybe an added reason why people don't do it that often because it's so unpredictable, right?
Mm-hmm. No, totally. But that's also the adventure and the part of it. I'm not the kind of person who loves just staying in my office to write articles and just go to my lab sometimes. I need those experiences, but also because I work on a topic that is so involved in many historical events, that is so discussed, that are in events that are still ongoing, that I would not feel comfortable with myself if I had to create models or make conclusions without talking to people actually involved or who had these life experiences. So it's really worth everything.
Okay, so now let's do it a practical side, right? So you go there to actually research what? Let's say in Rwanda, when you went there, what did you want to see?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of the main projects, so as I said, I was mostly conducting research on obedience to try understand how obeying orders impacts the brain. That can explain that, so many people can comply with very harmful orders directed towards another person. And the point of doing it in Rwanda was to understand what differs between those who did participate in a genocide and those who actively refused. For instance, when I conducted interviews with former genocide perpetrators in Rwanda or in Cambodia, more than 70% of them reported that the main reason for their participation was obedience to authority. And this has also been, one of the most famous examples that we have in Western world are the Nuremberg trials, where senior Nazi officers claim that they were just following orders. So this just following orders argument keeps coming again and again across different populations, across different historical events, different cultures. So yeah, it was really a question for me to understand, does it mean that these individuals have, I would say in layman's term, have a brain that is more sensitive to obedience to authority, while, for instance, rescuers, those who actively say no and even sometimes risk their own life to save others? Like, does it reflect biological differences in how their brain processes information when they obey orders? And so there have been different projects, of course, but one of the main ones was to understand this and using neuroscience method to see based on which brain mechanism they obey or disobey, and if their brain for the former perpetrators or rescuers differ in a way or in another.
So we're talking about something related to empathy, right? Guilt.
Yeah, notably, but not only. So actually, when you make a decision, for instance, if you make a moral or pro-social decision to benefit someone else or to harm someone else, there are different processes that can be involved. So, for instance, empathy is very common and very well known because it represents the fact that you can understand the pain of others, and it has been linked with pro-social intentions and behaviors. So, for instance, when you have more activity in empathy-related brain regions, studies have shown that you're more likely to be pro-social towards this person. So that could be one mechanism. But you may also have other mechanisms, such as interpersonal feeling of guilt regarding the consequences of your actions, your sense of agency when you perform an action, whether or not it triggers cognitive or moral conflict in your brain before you make the decision to harm or not someone. So there are different mechanisms that you can observe at different moments when people make decisions. And so the advantage of using EEG in that context is that since it has this millisecond precision, you can really track the decisional process of people and see what are the mechanisms that differ and when they have to make such decisions.
And what we know as well is very important and unfortunately used by political leaders, the idea of my group and the other, right? So the out group, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So that's another process that we have also been investigating, actually, because on the one hand, you can say, oh, so many former genocide perpetrators, they use the justification of just following orders to commit atrocities. But for sure, it's not the only mechanism. We cannot just resume an entire genocide by the just following orders arguments. It has been shown across history that many genocides or mass atrocities, they are preceded by various stages. And one of the most common one is the stage where an outgroup is classified, categorized, and dehumanized, creating this distinction, us versus them, which is very powerful, actually, because many neuroscience studies have shown that this classification impacts also how your brain processes information towards a so-called outgroup member or in-group member. So it's a very strong process that is also at play in episodes of mass violence. And that's also a scientific question to understand why, for instance, rescuers or refusers, they did not fall prey to this propaganda towards the outgroup.
And we all know this by looking at the brain. Are we sure that the right regions are the regions that we should be observing and then get all the conclusions? Is that causation, correlation? What do we know?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, there are different processes that can be at play. So for instance, in the literature in neuroscience, there are again, in this us versus them categorization, many studies that have focused on empathy-related brain regions that are relatively well-known via lots of rodent studies, neuromodulation studies that allows to bring more causal interpretation. So, for instance, if we know well the brain regions associated with empathy for pain, then we can test if when you see the pain of an out-group member compared to an in-group member, your brain will activate in those brain regions in the same way or not. But again, like for decision making, there are lots of different processes that can be impacted. And there are many neuroscience studies that have focused on other processes than empathy in this context. It's the case for everything that I'm mentioning, actually. It's never a single brain region. There is not like such a thing that a brain region is associated with obedience or a brain region is associated with intergroup biases. That's multiple processes that can be impacted by obedience or intergroup biases. And each of them can be the focus of different investigations.
And it eventually means that when you're studying it, it's like that region gets activated at a certain moment. Or what do you, I mean, the signal that you see, how does it practically work? Because I don't know that.
So it really depends what you're looking for. I'm just going to give you an example based on the former genocide perpetrators and rescuers in the case of obedience. So for instance, we had developed a task where they were receiving orders from the experimenter to take money or not from our research assistant. So each trial, they had to make the decision, I would obey or not this order. And after they obey or don't this order, they could see the face of a research assistant being sad or not to trigger an empathic emotional response towards the research assistant. And so what we did, for instance, for rescuers and former genocide perpetrators, is that we looked at how many times they would obey or disobey orders, just to see their general sensitivity to obedience, but also how their brain processes the sad face of the research assistant. And for instance, what we have observed is that rescuers, they have a higher activity in these empathy-related brain regions when they see the sad face of the research assistant compared to former perpetrators or bystanders. So it means that the former perpetrators and the bystanders, they also have these activations, but it's less activated than the rescuers. So it means that the rescuers, they process more empathy for the victim's pain, emotional pain, and this correlated with the frequency of refusing orders from the experimenter.
So, of course, I'm not sure whether you're the right person to answer this, but I know you're doing this research in order to improve our lives and help society, right? Is there a way to actually develop more rescuers through brain stimulation? I don't know what, or is it education? What is it?
Yeah, so that's exactly what I'm trying to figure out at the moment, because I start to combine lots of data now from different contexts, Rwanda, but also Israel more recently. So I'm really trying to understand, to focus on different processes and to see what is common across these different contexts that is linked to refusing or rescuing others during mass atrocities. I'm starting to have some, common ideas, and empathy is actually something that I've observed across many different contexts to be associated with resistance to immoral orders and so on. So, of course, we're not going to implement chips stimulating empathy in the brains of everyone. That's not going to work anyway for many reasons. But what we have seen also in Rwanda is that when we compare demographic and individual variables between rescuers and former perpetrators and bystanders, that one of the key distinctions between these groups is that rescuers, they had more role models in their lives. So during their childhood, they were more likely to have seen their parents or relatives also rescuing other human beings. And so perhaps this is what has, developed their empathy towards the distress of others. And so, for instance, as an intervention, more educational intervention at the moment, I'm developing a comic book for children, showing real-life refusers or rescuers, very ordinary people, such as those I'm interviewing in Rwanda or in other countries that have just rescued others. And I'm trying to show their stories to make them known, so to trigger this notion of role models, and also to emphasize empathy in the stories. And so the idea would be that, by showing that another choice is actually possible, that it would emulate somehow the same behaviors among the readers in their lives. I'm not saying that it's going to solve peace worldwide. That would be my dream, but of course I'm realistic here. But still, yeah, the idea is to have an overview of all of this and to try to develop more educational interventions. I mean, that's where I'm at the moment.
Are you still collecting the stories? You're
Yes,
still looking.
exactly.
Okay, so if
Yeah,
you can then share with me the link where people can contact if a rescuer is listening or someone knows someone who did something special. Remember what we are looking at. This is also what we do in science. You know, it's not the superheroes of science, right? It's just really
exactly.
ordinary people, because we have to have someone we can relate to, rather than, as we always say in Poland, it's so good that Maria Skłodowska-Curie was there, right? Because she basically ticks all the boxes. Amazing, very impressive, but very difficult to relate to, at least for me personally, right?
Yeah, no, clearly. And I think for me that one of the main issue, for instance, when you have books with superheroes, I mean, of course, they show, what it's like to be a moral heroes, to save others, but they most of the time have superpowers. So it's a bit unfair somehow. And what I want to show is that even very ordinary people have been able to do amazing acts of rescues during genocides, despite all the risks. And I also want to be sure that the book is inclusive, to show the human diversity of this and not to make like the wrong impression that only a part of the population is able to do that. And so it's in my to-do list actually to create this page where I make a general call, because I have stories from Israel, Rwanda, many in Europe during the Holocaust, of course. But I'm trying to extend this to the entire world to make sure I can collect people from different backgrounds, cultural, religion, whatever, to really show all these different stories. And so technically everyone could identify with at least one of these characters.
And again, probably look for some commonality as well, right? Just to show that it doesn't matter where we are.
Yeah.
It can be something that we can relate to, although it's a completely different society, the outgroup, as we would maybe say in this particular case.
Mm-hmm.
As we keep talking about rescuers, I think it's a good moment for you to ask the pub quiz question. Listeners, sorry, I know that it normally is in the beginning, but you already know me. When the discussion is interesting, I just can't stop it earlier enough to ask the question. So, Emilie, can you ask the question, and listeners, remember the answer only at the end of the podcast.
So for me, a critical question, for instance, if I was asking you, okay, imagine that you're in a society where a specific group of individuals is systematically blamed for everything that is going wrong in the society, whether it is true or false. And so imagine that you are in this society over the years, and then at some point, one of the solutions of the government is to start exterminating this other population to solve the issues of your society. The question for you is, do you think you would act as a perpetrator? So you would actively participate to defend your society against this outgroup? Or do you think that you would rather behave as a rescuer, meaning you would risk even your own lives to save these outgroup members?
And we will have some statistics to share later on. And remember, only at the end of the podcast. Okay, I am struggling a lot because, well, you are one of the researchers that does talk to other podcasters and publishes a lot. And you've written the book. We haven't even mentioned that. Of course, we mentioned the title because we talked a lot about that, Just Following Orders. Again, we will share the link in the show notes. And I have read it very, very recently. And there you will see a lot more than what, of course, we would discuss today. I don't know, can we jump from Rwanda already to Cambodia? I don't even feel that we've discussed enough about Rwanda, because there's also the fact that when it comes to rescuers, it was very difficult to actually find them, right? Because what is special about the genocide in Rwanda is that right now you can't really say to which ethnic group you belong, right? So you can't go and ask, like, were you on this side or that side?
Yeah, so indeed, in Rwanda, you cannot ask about ethnic groups, such as after the Holocaust. In Rwanda, there have been a large campaign of officially recognizing those who were rescuers officially, as well as former perpetrators or survivors. So even if nowadays you cannot ask, okay, which ethnic group you belong to, we have official lists of rescuers. And we know that one of the criteria was not being part of the target group. So meaning being Hutus, because the point of rescuing others was that your own group was part of the one who wanted extermination, and you somehow acted against your own in-group to help the outgroup individuals. And so we know exactly who is who, and we can conduct interviews. And actually Rwanda, it's why I did most of the research in Rwanda. In Cambodia, I went as well for interviews, but finding rescuers there was almost impossible. But in Rwanda, because of this official list and because the country has officially recognized the genocide and allows researchers working on genocide to conduct research there, that's actually easy in a way, because you can do such research. When you are in a country where it's not ongoing mass atrocities or ongoing genocide, most of the time when you're genocide scholars, you're not welcome. So it's more complicated to do that. But in Rwanda, I mean, of course, it takes lots of time. You need to gain trust, work with NGOs and so on. But that's actually where it's the most feasible. In Europe, that would be the same because we have many rescuers recognized after the Holocaust. But it was so many years ago that most of them are not alive anymore. So it's not really an option for science.
Whereas in Cambodia, the problem is that people avoid discussing it, right? Avoid discussing the genocide.
Yeah, so there are different issues in Cambodia. So it has been officially recognized as a genocide. So it means that if you work on genocide, you can enter the country quite safely. But for instance, finding rescuers there, I mean, for sure there are some, because I have some colleagues who have been able to manage to find a few. So first of all, it was not ethnic caused, the genocide there. It was more political, but also it lasted for a longer time period. In Rwanda, it lasted for 100 days. In Cambodia, it spanned across 4.5 years. And so what I've been told when I was there is that actually, yes, some people did try to resist, but over the course of 4.5 years, at some point, they were found and killed. And also to make sure that you're targeting actual perpetrators during that period is also very difficult because they haven't prosecuted all these people, while in Rwanda that was the case. So it means that in Cambodia, they only prosecuted the top leaders of the Khmer Rouge regime, but not the more low-level executioners. And so, they will never be prosecuted. So why would people say, oh, yeah, I did participate and kill people during the genocide? So of course, to know that, we need to work also with local NGOs, but it's also much more difficult to identify clearly who really was a perpetrator, who was just working for the regime but did not kill anyone. That's very blurred there.
So in general, you have less data from Cambodia than from Rwanda, as you said.
Yeah, exactly. Rwanda, I go there every year. I have lots of data. I know the country very well. Cambodia was there once. It was very informative to conduct interviews, to conduct how a genocide impacts the brain related to a trauma or intergroup biases. But in terms of categories of people, for me, experimentally, it's much more complicated to find what I need to have proper research questions.
What about Israel? Because that's a story I was not aware of.
Yeah, I was in Israel in last November, and I'm actually continuing conducting studies there at the moment. So that's why it's not public yet, in the sense, I'm talking about it, but I haven't published yet. It's in the review process. But indeed, I had this opportunity of studying resistance and participation during an active conflict. Because even, for instance, when I'm studying these populations in Rwanda, one argument could be that, those people, they really participated or rescued others, but it was 30 years ago. So how can we sure that what we observe would still be relevant in case of an ongoing conflict, for instance? And so Israel, of course, was highly relevant in this context because it's a protracted conflict that lasted for decades. And we are not now all aware that there are more and more discussions on the fact that it has reached the level of genocide against Palestinians. And so I was there in that context to also study those who refuse active participation in the military conflicts and those who actually participate. So it was an exceptional opportunity in terms of, scientific research, because it has never been done like that before. And I'm still working on finalizing the writing of the papers and so on.
Was it easy to go there? Because, as you said, it's an ongoing conflict and you're declaring something that might not be welcome by everyone.
No, indeed. That was much more complicated. So, of course, in terms of travel, I don't know even where to start to explain this. So what is I would say the part of the story is that's a grant to study in Israel that I obtained in 2022, 2023. And so it was not at the scale of what we have seen nowadays. Of course, it was an ongoing conflict and so on, but not at that scale. And actually, the grant started on October 1st, 2023. So I had the plan to go to Israel to study it. And on October 7th, the Hamas attacked. Then the Israeli Defense Force responded to an extent that we all know or we are all aware of. And so actually, I gave up going because of the escalation of the conflict in terms of security reasons. I mean, there were many reasons for which it was not possible. And then I started being in contact with people from there, not necessarily academics, but also NGOs, who did offer their help for me to come and to access these populations. And so that was, of course, a huge family decision as well, because that's an active conflict. You never know what's going to happen in terms of security. And also because I knew that, of course, I would not be very welcome in the country if I would actively state, oh, I want to study those who are refusing to participate in what you're doing. So yeah, in terms of ethics, that's one of the cases. For instance, I asked the ethics agreement of my own university because institutional agreements across Belgian and Israeli institutions were forbidden. So impossible to ask for the ethics there, but also because that's active and we never know the politics behind it. Of course, it would have been biased probably as well. So not necessarily the members of the ethics committee, but the evaluation of something like this. So yeah, I did collect data, but I was not actively working with academic partners. I was working mostly with NGOs, and we recruited people who actively refused taking part. So they risk jails, they risk social ostracism from the society. They're considered as traitors by most of the Israeli society. And those who actively participated in recent or previous events of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
And do you already have some data to share with us? Do you have something that you found out, or too early?
It's very preliminary because I'm working on the papers right now. So what I'm saying would not be like huge conclusions, but just observations that I have, even though they fit with the paper, but the papers are not published yet. So I will be cautious. One of the main things I was interested in was to understand, these just following arguments. Is it used by former perpetrators, for instance, in Rwanda or the Holocaust or Cambodia? Because that's kind of a retrospective process. So it means that, yes, now they say it's because I just followed orders, but at the moment of their participation, perhaps it was something totally different, such as intergroup hatred, because we know that us versus them is very strong and influence a lot of people. So that's for the interview parts. That was one of the things I wanted to investigate, like, okay, those who are participating, how they justify their participation. But of course, here the culture is also a bit different because in Israel, participation as a military personnel is mandatory at the age of 18 for all Israeli citizens, that have a Judaism or no religion at least. And so for many of them in the interviews, they reported that they did it. They did participate because it was mandatory by law. But what is interesting, for instance, is that refusers, technically they have the same obligations, but they still decide to refuse. And most of the time, the consequences are jail for a few weeks, 2 months. That's pretty common. But those refusers, they prefer to go to jail for a couple of weeks or months than actively participating in the killings. And there are different types of refusers. You have some refusers who are military members. And at some point during the conflict, they say, no, it's too much for me. For moral reasons, I just cannot continue. So I will stop. And so these are military refusers, but we also have civilian refusers who have like 18 years old. They have this mandatory duty to participate in military activities, and they say no. And I'm honestly very impressed at the personal level by these people, because at 18 years old, being able to say no to the law, prefer to go to jail for your ideological reasons, while the militarization of the society is so strong that all your family, all your friends, all the society pushes you to do this military service. The strength, the mental strength that is required is always very impressive. For me, I would say that honestly, I don't even know if I would have been able to make such a decision at 18 years old.
And did you look at their brains then?
So in that study in Israel, I didn't took my electroencephalogram with me because that would have been too obvious what I was there for. In the plane or at the embassy or whatever, carrying electroencephalograms, No,
It's not something you just take for your holidays,
No, exactly. I mean, I'm not sure if I would have said something like that, the custom borders who have trusted me. So no, for there, I only did interviews and behavioral tasks on computers with behaviors and implicit measurements, such as decision times in different tasks, measuring their sensitivity to intergroup biases or their sensitivity to various forms of authority. But no, in this context, the electroencephalogram was not something possible.
That's a pity, but I guess that will be, in general, for ongoing conflicts, a bit difficult, right? We cannot.
Yeah, exactly. That's already an insane opportunity to have been able to do this research in this context. So yeah, the neuroscience part there is another. When the EEG will measure 1 centimeter, as total in perhaps 20 years, for sure I can take some with me, but not at the moment.
Okay. We've run through a lot of things, and I have a feeling that we need to summarize a little bit for people, right? Mm-hmm. So just to kind of give the key concepts of your research. So when we talk about this whole idea of just following orders, we're talking in the end about the sense of agency, aren't we, right? Whether we feel that we're doing it ourselves or somebody told us.
Yeah, agency is one of the key processes, but also if we really feel the pain that we are causing to others, for instance, with empathy, that's on one of the other processes.
And then we have guilt as well. Mm-hmm. Not feeling guilt when you're doing it or not.
Yes, exactly. We have seen with fMRI, notably, that when we obey orders, the brain regions associated with our feeling of guilt are less activated than when we do such actions, but freely. So it shows that actually when you obey orders, you feel less guilt regarding the consequences of your actions.
And then also something we didn't talk about. So we talked about the in-group and out-group, but we also didn't talk about the group influence. This is also very important. If you're in a group, you tend to actually do what the group does, right?
Yes, exactly. It refers to conformity. And this has also been used, although less frequently than the just following orders argument. But some former perpetrators in Rwanda, they do say that they also participated because the group influenced them. But it's also very specific to Rwanda because there, during the genocides, there were groups of people forming small militias that were going to kill together during the day. That also depends from one context to another, but the group is also a huge source of influence.
What else? Maybe why do we resist orders? What do you know for now? Because we kind of touched upon it, and I know you were avoiding as well because not all of the research is yet done, and you probably have a lot of plans for the future. Yeah. But what do we know?
What do we know? So for sure, empathy seems to be a key process because this is something I have observed, that higher empathy for victims correlates with refusal. I've seen that in Rwanda. I've seen that among student populations in Belgium. I've seen that across military populations as well. So it seems to be like a key factor. But then you also have like life experiences, such as having observed role models in your lives. We have also some studies showing that the more you were in contact with the so-called outgroup during your life, the less likely you are going to be involved in this participation because you know them better. That's the contact hypothesis. If you're more in contact with an outgroup, you're less likely to develop intergroup biases towards this outgroup. We also have some studies showing some personality traits related to the act of refusal or rescuing others. For instance, empathy, altruism, or be less sensitive to authoritarianism, will also be seen more prominent among rescuers or refusers than controls or former perpetrators. So the difficult thing with rescuing is that it's not a single factor that is going to explain that you are going to refuse participation into mass atrocities. It's, a convergence of different factors that touches different parts of your life and of your experiences and of your brain.
And we tend to think that given the chance, we would all be rescuers. So let's go back to the question that you asked to show our listeners what the data shows so far when it comes to rescuers.
Regarding the responses I have mostly for the question I asked during the podcast. So I've been asking this question to very various audiences. And most of the time, the huge majority of people, they would say that they would act as rescuers. And it goes between 70% to more than 95%. I mean, on the one hand, it's positive because you can say, oh, many people would act as rescuers, so we're safe in a way. But actually, when you look at the real statistics during genocides, it's rather the total opposite. So I've been trying to compute numbers of rescuers across the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda or the Holocaust, and it's less than 1% of the population who actually act as rescuers. It shows also that, you know, it's very good to think that we would do the moral things when something like that is happening. But it's also good to self-realize that when you look at the real statistics, not that many people are able to act in such a way. And I think it's clever to say that we actually don't know what we would do ourselves if we are not in that situation.
Absolutely. And what I was also thinking is that when you're given a chance to vote like this, others are looking at you as well because you're doing it in a group. And I think it also takes quite some guts to say, like, I would not rescue where everybody is looking that you're saying that you're not going to be a rescuer, right? Because in this case, there is also group pressure, or maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, but it depends because, for instance, in the YouTube video you watch for the Falling Walls Foundation, it was not in front of everyone. It was, in specific booths, but it was still with public around. But most of the time when I'm doing it during conferences, I do it with an app. So people just answer anonymously from their own phone.
Yes, of course. I mean, how could I even suppose that you're collecting data with a bias? Maximum possible. What I also noticed, this is obviously not the main direction of your studies, but in your book at certain moment, you were also talking about something that really got me interested also in the context of the podcast, which is the responsibility when it comes to working with machines. So all the AI revolution right now, I want to touch upon it. Of course, this is not something we're going to discuss a lot, but it is interesting what you are writing about, that there is a little bit of an imbalance, let's say, when we involve the whichever generative AI or other AI or machine robot in the loop, isn't there?
Yeah, exactly. And that's something that is still ongoing, but also that is more and more investigated. I mean, with what I see with when there is a situation involving two human beings, for instance, someone giving orders, someone obeying orders, most of the time the responsibility, and I mean responsibility per se, but also empathy, for instance, or guilt, is really diffused across individuals. So it's like the human brain tends to, when it can minimize its involvement in something, it will do it. And that's the case in hierarchical chains, for instance, for the many people that are involved. But of course, now with the use of machines, AIs, drones, automatic or not, that's also very important to understand this in terms of responsibility. Like the fact that you're using intermediaries such as machines to do the action instead of yourself. Does it mean that you would be able to conduct more antisocial and harmful actions towards others because you just say, okay, it's the machine and you are feeling distant from the outcomes? Or on the contrary, because it's not another human being and you know that the machine has no proper intentionality or responsibility, you will feel more responsible for what you're doing because you cannot really diffuse it to someone else. There are a bit the two sides that can be investigated, and that is clearly ongoing, and especially now with AI, because AI can also help you to make decisions. It's not conscious, but at the same time, it's very realistic. So how it diffuses your own feeling of responsibility when you have to decide to harm or favor someone else is also very crucial at the societal level.
It is also something that interests me a lot, nowadays when you have to always declare whether you used AI to generate any text, right? And where is the thin line between I own it, right? Yes. And where is the thin line between, no, this was because of course, if you say that, then people might say, oh, come on, she doesn't even write her own things, right? So you prefer to kind of bend the reality a little bit. And then exactly, if it's edited, then it's me. If it edited by AI, I mean, and if it's not, it's very difficult. And that's just a simple thing. We're not talking about any kind of, war context or military context. It's just a text that you're putting out there. But I do feel that there is something going on with the responsibility factor.
Yeah, clearly. And that's clearly something that should be investigated. But I have the feeling that AI has arrived in our daily lives. Of course, it existed for a long time, but suddenly it has appeared. And now we are trying to deal with all the consequences and all the implications. But we never really had the time to process that before. And the development of AI is way faster than our own retrospection about what it does, how do we feel, and so on. So, yeah.
Yes, the ethical part of it is tricky. Also, the regulation part of it is tricky, and everything in between. And of course, you know that you can listen to some of the discussions I had before about that. I'm not trying to now make you discuss AI in detail because that is not your specialization. But just to wrap up, last question. What's next? So, I started the discussion with why bother? So I am kind of expecting that the next thing is going to be yet another, I'm going to prove this is possible. So what are you thinking of right now?
Yeah, that's a good point. Honestly, after Rwanda, I thought, okay, I've reached the limit of what we can do. And then came Israel. So I was like, well, perhaps I can take another step with active ongoing conflicts. In this field, honestly, I'm not really sure. The only thing I'm sure for the research on obedience and disobedience is that thanks to the book, but also, this research, I'm contacted by many people across the world saying, oh, but you can come in my country studying similar processes. Like I've been invited to South Korea to study people who were escaping North Korea, having offered the possibility to study people who are working for Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And it's more a matter of no opportunities come on their own because I am making myself a name in this field research and genocide studies or high conflict studies. So yeah, that could be a follow-up. But honestly, I think one of my main line of research now is going to focus more on prisons and incarceration, a line that I'm already developing at the moment, but with neuroscience method to show how incarceration and prison impacts the brain of inmates and why reintegration into the society fails so often, like what prison does to the brain. Because most of the time in neuroscience, when we are studying inmates, it's always about the criminal brain. Like, okay, these people have a dysfunction in their brain and that's why they're criminal. And that's most of the time the main message that you can find in the literature. But I want to show that another part of the problem is the prison brain, like what incarceration does exactly to your brain and what it involves. But it's also very difficult to enter with these equipments in prisons, testing inmates. But that will be one of the next line of research as well.
And probably also looking into how open the prisons are, what it does, right? Because this also is an important factor.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So we'll be looking forward to some papers about it, and hopefully maybe we can rediscuss it in a couple of years once you have the proper... So I'm not asking you about preprints and whatever, but there is something that you can really say, this is the result right now. Hopefully you will also write on your blog. I would love to read more about the methods and all the behind the scenes. I really read almost everything yesterday night instead of sleeping. So I will definitely share the link in the show notes for those ones who are interested. And what remains is to thank you so much for the day, Emilie. It was a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for the invitation. That was also a very pleasant discussion.
Thank you. And of course, listeners, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and check what we are writing about the new episodes and everything else. We'll be wrapping up for the summer, so there'll be a little bit of a break. But then we're coming, hopefully, I still haven't recorded it, but we're coming with a very, very special guest in September. So don't miss this out. And yes, this was SciLux, and my name is Hanna Siemaszko.